I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the prosecutors. Today on The Prosecutors, we conclude our investigation into the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this episode of The Prosecutors. I am your host, Brett, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Alice.
Hey, Brett. Good to hear from you again.
It's good to talk to you, too, Alice. You know, as we continue, I don't want to belabor the point, because I feel like we talk about it every episode, but as we continue to do our socially distanced podcast, it is good to hear your voice, even if I don't get to see your face.
Well, I'm hopeful that we'll get to see each other soon enough. But in the meantime, we get to connect in this way.
Yeah, it's great. So I just want to say thank you to everybody who's listening to the podcast. I want to give a special shout out to our apparent fan in Clichy, Ile-de-France. We don't have any swag, but if we ever make t-shirts or anything, let us know who you are and we'll shoot you one. They've downloaded all our episodes, so I'm going to call them this is an international sensation, our podcast. So
Thank you for listening. We really do appreciate it.
Yeah, don't forget to leave those positive reviews, everybody. No negative reviews, just positive reviews. Yeah, so today we are continuing our investigation into the disappearance of Brian Shaffer. You know, I say investigation, it's more just a discussion because there's nothing to investigate. There's basically no evidence, no clues, no leads, no witnesses, nothing.
It really is. I mean, it's like, what do you have a podcast about when there's nothing to talk about?
Yeah, like people call this the King of Disappearances. And, you know, it may be, but I don't think it's actually talked about as much as some of the other ones that we're going to look at. I mean, it's obviously not talked about as much as Maura Murray. And I think despite the circumstances of this disappearance, as we talked about yesterday and how bizarre and dramatic they are, the fact that there's so little to really even talk about or to hang your hat on, I think is one reason that we don't see this discussed maybe as much as you would expect.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I guess there's not as much that you can speculate on because there's just so little information to go on. I mean, trust me, people speculate, and that's what we're doing here as well. But unlike Maura Murray, where there are other touch points, this is just so into thin air.
Yeah.
Which leads us to, there are theories about what happened here. And, last time we promised you that we would dive straight into theories this time. There are some popular theories. We're going to talk about them today. I guess I'll kick us off, Brett, unless you have something else you want to add.
No, I'm ready to go. Let's do it. Let's solve this disappearance.
Let's dive into this. So last time we talked about how a lot of closed circuit cameras catch him going in. No camera catches him coming out. We don't see him ever again after he talks to some girls on camera, and then he apparently talks to his friends, Clinton Meredith. Now, I know this has kind of become a running joke now that we start our theories off with an alien theory. But of all of the cases we've talked about so far, I think that this case is the only one where aliens did it is not a completely laughable theory. And I say this because it's really hard to disappear into thin air.
I know.
Absolutely.
I think it was aliens.
Well, there you go. And that's it for the prosecutors this time. Join in next time for a longer episode.
Yeah. It's like the pyramids, right? You know, they've been trying to figure out how they built the pyramids for forever, and they have all these, theories about it, but none of the theories really seem to work. So you kind of eventually just, throw up your hands and say, must have been aliens. So I'm going with that. I think it's aliens.
Or supernatural, or supernatural, right? Maybe not aliens, but supernatural. Because I mean, I thought about this a lot. So what if he just slipped through? There's this one tiny place he had to leave from in order not to be caught on camera. So he does. But then most people don't want to just disappear from life when they have a medical degree they're pursuing, a girlfriend that they love, parent, a dad that they just saw earlier that day, and a brother that they called and wanted to hang out with that night. This is a connected man. That's why I don't think it's completely laughable that something supernatural happened here.
Have you ever heard of the backroom theory, Alice?
No, I have not. What's that?
So the backroom theory, or the backrooms, or the backroom conspiracy, is this really kind of creepy theory that some people have. I don't even know if it's a theory really as much as sort of like a weird like creepypasta mind game or whatever. But it's that, you're in a place and you accidentally sort of pass through this dimensional portal essentially, and you end up in this space that is essentially this empty, like back room of a store, right? So you know how like the store, it's all decorated and fancy and everything. And then if you've ever worked in these kind of places, you go into the back rooms and it's all bare and all the rooms look the same and there's nothing special about them whatsoever. And so this is this weird sort of theory that people play around with, that this sort of like alternate dimension exists where you can kind of get lost and then you end up just wandering through these back rooms forever. Like I said, I think it's meant more to be creepy than serious. But with Brian Shaffer, it's almost like you can imagine that happening, that he goes off to talk to the band, or maybe he goes to the bathroom and he just like stumbles through a rip in space and time and ends up in some alternate universe. I don't know. It's such a weird disappearance that, like you said, we don't often give much credence to aliens or paranormal, but this one's an exception. I mean, this is one where if you believe in paranormal activity like that, this is one you could point to.
That's totally right. But don't worry, we'll start there. We're not going to end there because, after all, we are prosecutors. And if we went into court and said aliens did it, our case would not fly. So we're going to explore some other theories.
And the only evidence for aliens or paranormal is just the fact that there's no evidence of anything else. So it's kind of like, Sherlock Holmes or whatever.
It's the big question mark.
Yeah, if you eliminate the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the answer. So maybe at the end of the day, it was aliens. But we're going to go ahead and say it probably wasn't aliens. The next theory people talk about, we talked about this a little bit yesterday, is that Clint killed him, or that he knows what happened to him. And this is almost entirely based on the fact that he would not take that polygraph and his supposed unusual comments afterwards, which we can't actually verify. I know his brother has said that, but I don't know, frankly, if his brother is also kind of relying on rumor and innuendo about that. And there's actually, he didn't hear these firsthand. The problem with this, if you go online, if you read Reddit, if you read web sleuths, a lot of people have focused on Clint intensely. And I think one of the reasons is because it's difficult for them to imagine not helping their friend in this circumstance. But I think you really kind of put your finger on it yesterday, Alice, about why this is not as unusual as people think. I actually don't think that Clint and Brian were all that close. So it doesn't actually surprise me that at the end of the day, Clint, kind of chose what was best for him over what might have helped advance this investigation. And you got to think, once again, if Clint knows that he doesn't know anything, then he also knows that taking the polygraph isn't going to help find Brian. What it might do is get him in trouble. It might get him in an awkward position. So it's not surprising that he decides, I'm not going to take the polygraph. there's also the problem of how exactly did Clint kill Brian? Because, and this is something we should think about as we talk about all of these theories. At the end of the day, the two sort of overarching things that I think really eliminate one theory or another are Brian's state of mind and the video, and the fact that nothing is caught on closed circuit television.
And you have to remember this. If Clint killed him, he had to have done so in a shockingly fast time frame. What, 5 minutes?
Exactly.
Um,
Exactly.
I mean, that's so fast because we know that Clint leaves at a certain time, and I think that leaves us about a 5-minute gap. That's a really fast time to locate someone, kill them in a crowded bar that's closing, meaning lights are going up. So this is not like a dark room. I'm imagining the band's packing up, the lights are going up, everyone's kind of saying their last goodbyes, and then to run out, have had the time to dispose of the body in a way that it's never found again. It just seems like a very difficult task to accomplish in such a short amount of time.
And is Meredith complicit in this? Because Meredith is with Clint, and Meredith, you might recall, took the polygraph. So presumably, Meredith was asked questions about whether or not she knew where Brian was. She said no, and she passes. So not only did Clint have to do this and do it quickly, he had to do it without Meredith's knowledge. And then he has to, like you said, dispose of that body. How could he do that? How could he pull that off? It just doesn't make any sense. So, yeah, I mean, I know people focus on Clint. I know people want to believe he knows something, but I don't think he does. And I think the fact he won't take that polygraph doesn't tell us much. We're going to talk about in a second the theory that Brian decided to kind of run away or disappear. And this is connected to this because people think maybe Clint helped. And the reason he doesn't want to take a polygraph is actually altruistic, because he knows he'll have to lie about Brian and knowing where Brian is, and he'll fail the polygraph.
And again, it seems kind of strange to rely on someone you barely know to help you get away forever. And remember,
Exactly.
he did call his brother to hang out that night, and his brother, probably knows him pretty well and would know something is up. So if Brian wanted to get away unnoticed, why try and bring along someone who knows you better than just about anyone else?
I mean, I don't know if you've ever thought about how you would disappear if you wanted to disappear. I haven't really thought about it until thinking about this case, but I was thinking about it yesterday, sort of in preparation for this discussion. And I can think, if I decided I wanted to do this for whatever reason, I want to vanish into thin air and leave my entire life behind. There's one person that I would consider bringing into that conspiracy to help me. My, very best friend going back to high school. Alice, I think we're very close. I would not tell you if I was going to disappear into thin air.
Gee, Brett, I thought we were closer than that. You were going to be my one person.
Yeah. Like, I don't think, number one, because you would judge me. It's got to be the right person, right? It's got to be like a kind of and I hate to say this about my friend, but somebody who would be complicit in that kind of thing. And it has to be somebody.
And someone you trusted.
Exactly. Somebody you trust implicitly, completely. That's not the guy you hadn't talked to since St. Patrick's Day. So whatever Clint is and whatever their relationship and whatever happened to Brian, one thing I think we can say with 100% certainty, more than we can say for aliens and the paranormal, is that Clint has nothing to do with it.
That's going to be a controversial position, but I agree with you. So then that leads us to the next theory, that Brian is the one who caused this to happen. Brian ran away or he committed suicide. So we know that Brian was depressed about his mom's death that just happened a few weeks previously. Maybe Brian just wanted to get away. See, on March 28th, 2006, just a few days before Brian went missing, Alexis reported that Brian jokingly suggested they should skip class the next day and run away together. But seemingly in contradiction, Alexis also said that he had once suggested recently that Alexis should move on from him due to his grief. And it makes sense. His mom just died.
There's nothing unusual about any of that. is the thing. You know what I mean? Like, that's not, neither one
Absolutely.
of those things is crazy.
No, no, not at all. And you know what this says to me? It says to me that Alexis and Brian are doing well in a relationship. He doesn't say, leave me because I don't love you anymore or you don't love me. It's saying, my grief is so large that I don't want to have to put you through this because I love you that much.
Right.
Um, you know, some people may suggest that he was trying to run away from her. Those two anecdotes about what Alexis says Brian was feeling, to me sounds like they were actually doing really well and he loved her very much. So I don't know if I don't think we've talked about this previously, but this is very tragic. Brian's dad actually ends up dying in a freak accident during a storm a couple years later in 2008. And after Brian's dad died, someone left a message on the obituary page that said, Dad, I love you. Love, Brian. And in parentheses, U.S. Virgin Islands. Now, this comment was traced to a public computer in Franklin County, Ohio, not the Virgin Islands, and it's presumed to be a hoax. I have to say that's a very sick joke that someone probably played, because if Brian in fact wanted to be running away and never to be found again, why sign, love Brian on an obituary page? His dad's not reading it. He could have written just I love you or Dad, I love you, not said love Brian. So I think that was likely someone playing a really dark joke.
No, I think it's really sick, and it just goes to how evil some people are, and you see that in these cases sometimes. It brings out the worst in people. I'll say my understanding is the police actually went ahead and took this seriously, and the folks in the Virgin Islands did go around to bars and show people pictures of Brian, and no one in the Virgin Islands, reported seeing him or knowing him or anything like that. So, in addition to the fact the comment apparently came from a library in this nearby county, he wasn't in the Virgin Islands. So, yeah, I think we can say this is a hoax.
And I think some people liked the idea that it maybe was him in the Virgin Islands because everyone does agree that Brian had a real wanderlust. He liked to travel. He often talked about heading out to some tropical beach, the whole dream of starting a band, buy a bar, have drinks in paradise. But maybe he did that. And some people suggest that Brian just changed clothes, did slip out of the bar undetected. But again, the police who reviewed the camera footage, they weren't just looking for clothes. They were looking for each individual person that came in and out. And even if Brian changed clothes, there would have been an unaccounted person who came in and then left. And they did not find that. They did not find someone leave, even in different clothes, that did not come in first.
Yeah, and I think people give this more credence than they would in a different case just because there's just no evidence, as we've talked about. So you can kind of go wherever you want. As we talked about, I think, with Maura Murray and with the lighthouse keepers, whenever people disappear, somebody always says they left to start a new life. And
I think it's really romantic.
It is romantic. And it would be nice.
It would be nice that someone isn't tragically gone forever, that they chose to be this way, and it kind of makes a little bit more sense of our world so that it's a friendlier place to be.
Right. Yeah, I think that's 100% right. I think there is some real psychology behind this, and I'm not saying people don't do it. Now, usually they do it because, they're a criminal or whatever. I mean, when you hear these stories, it tends to be person escaped from the jail 40 years ago, moved to Alaska and started a new life. That does happen. The thing about this case, number one, I mean, going back to what I said earlier, this still doesn't account for the surveillance cameras. Maybe if Brian changed clothes, it would, but as you pointed out, how do you explain the fact there's no unaccounted for, guy wearing baggy clothes and a hat down over his eyes or whatever you think happened here? Number two, where'd he get these clothes? Because we saw him come in. Like, you can look at the video. There's a still shot that we'll post on the website. He doesn't have a duffel bag. He doesn't have clothes that he's going to change into. Number three, if you were going to disappear, is this how you would do it? You would just Irish goodbye from a bar at the end of a bar crawl, and then that's when you vanish into the ether? I just, it's hard for me to imagine that that's how you would do it.
You could do this from your apartment where there are not cameras around. You could
Right.
you could legitimately go home for the night and no one would suspect anything because you said goodbye. Go back to your apartment and then slip out in the wee hours of the morning when there are no cameras around because you don't live at the bar.
It's actually a far better way to do it, right? Like if you were going to do it, you would do it that way. And you're just going back to the cameras, because I just want to turn to the cameras once again. Imagine, okay, just put yourself in this situation and you decide you want to disappear into the ether. Assume for a second that the reason Brian's not accounted for in the surveillance video of the escalator is that he slipped out a back door somehow. You know, maybe he was wearing a disguise, and so he managed to slip out of the back door and nobody noticed. He still would have had to avoid all those other cameras that people are looking at, all the other surveillance cameras. And how would you do that? Like, pick your favorite bar and imagine how you would escape from it. You have no idea where the surveillance cameras are. You might know where a couple are, but you don't know where most of them are. Like Brian may have left that bar and avoided surveillance, but it was pure dumb luck if that happened. And that just doesn't fit with this grand scheme that he had to go to the Ugly Tuna Saloona and vanish, because that's what you got to believe. You have to believe this was a integral part of him disappearing, was going to the Ugly Tuna and vanishing from there. And it's just ridiculous. It's just ridiculous. Like you said, so much easier just to say, if you wanted to have one more night out with the guys, you know, with a guy you hadn't seen in a month, and you wanted to have one more dinner with your dad, okay, fine. But yeah, why don't you just go home after the bar, you know, or say goodbye to Meredith and Clint and then disappear? That's perfectly fine as well. Like, you could do that. Like, the notion that you would go to all this trouble to vanish from the Ugly Tuna, it just doesn't make any sense. And this is super popular. I mean, people come back to this over and over and over again. But as unlikely as some of the other theories that we're going to talk about probably are, this one, maybe it's not as unlikely as Clint doing it, because there's at least a possibility he did this, but I still think aliens are more likely than Brian decided to start a new life in Fiji playing guitar at a bar.
Yeah. So far we have 1, the paranormal. 2, no other theory.
Right.
So let's talk about some other theories then before people turn off the podcast.
Exactly. Let's go to the next one. The band killed him. The band killed him, or alternatively, he left with the band.
Wait, here's actually a question. Did the band appear on the cameras as in terms of leaving?
They did, unfortunately. Because for a long time...
Oh, sorry, I just shot down your theory.
I really favored this theory. I thought this theory actually made a lot of sense. Not that Brian was killed by the band. I always thought that was kind of silly. But that he goes over, he talks to him, the place starts to close. He's like, hey, man, let me give you a hand with your guitar or your drums or whatever. And he just walked down with them, put the stuff in the back of their van. He's already outside. He sees sayonara, or he says sayonara, and goes on. And that's sort of how he got out of the bar without being noticed. You still have the problem with the local surveillance cameras, but, you know, maybe they just missed him when they looked at it. It's a little bit harder to review all that camera footage than the footage on the actual escalator. So that, I like that theory. And look, you know, there are some things that commend it. You know, they were the last people he supposedly talked to. And whenever you're the last person to see or speak to someone before they disappear or they die, there's going to be a lot of focus on you. So yeah, you had that as a possibility. The problem is the police have reviewed the surveillance video of the door that the band was using to exit. They have seen them load their equipment up, and Brian is nowhere to be seen. And in fact, and I don't know if this tells us a whole lot, but the band has no recollection of meeting Brian or speaking with him. I am sure at every gig they play, at the end, 30 different drunk guys with, Pearl Jam tattoos or whatever are coming up and talking to him. So it's not surprising that they don't remember him, but they also don't remember, him coming back to their apartment and overdosing on drugs, and then they, threw him in the river or whatever.
And the problem with this theory, I think, is that the complete lack of any motive. Obviously, of course murders can happen without motive, but what we see in our cases, there's usually a motive somewhere. Brian means nothing to this band. They don't have any pre-existing relationship. There's no reason that they would care about this guy who is in med school, and probably like a lot of people in a college or university setting, they're studying, but they wish that they were some artist somewhere if they play an instrument. And so it's just hard to believe when they have absolutely no motive, no connection to this guy, that they would be part of any sort of plot to murder or dispose of his body.
I think the only way it works is if, Brian talked to him, and this is putting aside the video. If Brian had talked to him and they were like, hey man, we're going to, a party at our drummer's house. He's got some good stuff, some pure China white or whatever. Why don't you come with us? Brian goes, he overdoses, and they dispose of the body to avoid sort of the legal complications thereof. It's similar to what you see with the Loon Mountain 3 in Maura Murray. That is one of the sort of popular theories, is that they didn't kill her, but she overdosed and they got rid of the body. So the advantage to that is it gets him away from the bar, and it explains why his body has not been found. The problem with that is a couple things. Number one, going back to one of our rules, really hard to keep a secret. You wonder if all the members of the band would have kept this secret for this long, or if one of them would have cracked and told somebody. And of course, the video. There's just no evidence that Brian ever even talked to these guys, much less had any kind of interaction with them. I mean, he might have said, hey, I'm going to go talk to the band, walked over that way, and 10 other people are talking to them, and he's like, never mind, I'll just go to use the bathroom. And he never even speaks to him. We don't have any evidence of any interaction between them, much less a significant one.
So another theory is that Brian fell in a hole in the construction site and he got covered up somehow, which is why we've never been able to find him. So this is actually a really popular theory. And it goes that Brian somehow gets out of the bar without being seen, and he falls into a hole in a construction zone and gets covered up. Like maybe the bulldozer comes the next day and pushes dirt into the hole, not knowing someone's in there. Now, the site, the construction site, was at a stage of construction where it would be difficult to navigate for a drunk person, because there's open holes, there's piles of supplies, there's equipment, things everywhere. It wasn't just a cleared space or a building that was to the point of being almost finished. It was very much a construction site in the midst of being built. And this is relatively near to the bar, so it's not, a crazy theory. It's a site that's close to it. But the police are adamant that they scoured this entire construction area and they cannot find Brian there. There's no sign of Brian there.
I think people overestimate how easy it would be to build someone into a building. I heard one police officer talking about this theory, and he was like, if they did that, the construction guys would literally have had to, stare at Brian's body while they poured in the concrete. I mean, there might have been holes, but there were no 100 feet shafts running into the earth or anything. and it's just not good construction technique to include people's bodies in your building, because they decay, even in concrete, and will generally cause cracks and various other problems with your construction, to debunk a popular long-standing myth, and turn off the podcast now if you don't want to have this debunked, but like there are no bodies, for instance, in the Hoover Dam. It's a very popular romantic thing that the Hoover Dam was built so quickly that people fell into the wet concrete. They just continued to build because they couldn't stop and slow down. And, human life was cheap during the Depression and all that stuff. There's even, if you're a fan of the country super band, the Highwayman, in their eponymous song, The Highwayman, one of the verses is actually about this happening, someone falling into the concrete. But that's not how you do concrete. You didn't just pour like one massive slab to create the Hoover Dam. You actually do it in very small squares. So if someone did fall into the concrete, they would just be like right there once again, like staring up at you saying, "Hey man, will you help me out of the concrete?" Like, so, and bad thing to have decaying bodies in your dam holding back millions of tons of water. So all this to say that if Brian were there, someone would have seen him. Some people say, well, maybe the construction company didn't want to be liable for him falling into their hole, and so he ordered him covered up.
Pretty big gamble for the company.
If you're just like Joe Blow union worker here to pour some concrete, are you going to be like, "Yes, sir, boss, I'll do that"?
Right, you're moving from negligence or attractive nuisance to criminal. One of them is you pay a fine and you have to, comply with stricter regulations. The other one is you go to jail and you lose everything. It seems a bit difficult there.
And look, this does have the advantage of, the two things we talked about, overarching themes, Brian's state of mind and the cameras. It actually deals with both of those problems because apparently one of the doors that normally open to the outside from the Ugly Tuna opened into this construction site. And there are conflicting reports that this exit was not covered by cameras. So the theory is this is the one place he could have gone and not be viewed. So since we don't see him leave, he must have left through this way. That would have put him in the construction area. He must have never gotten out of the construction area, and thus he is still there. Look, I think this is our first theory that is more plausible than aliens, but there are so many things that cut against it. I think the chances of Brian being in that construction site are very, 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 very low. I would not bet on this one if you're wondering what happened to Brian Shaffer.
Yeah, I agree with you there. I think for me, this theory still skips or, doesn't explain the not being caught on camera thing, which I think is really difficult to get over.
Yeah, it's almost impossible. So the next theory, which suffers from exactly the same problem, is that Brian either fell in the river and his body was carried away, or his killer put him in the river. So look, Brian wasn't mugged. He wasn't mugged and killed. Typically people, who mug people, number one, they don't typically kill people. Number two, when they do, they just want to get away. You're not going to have a mugger who's going to kill you in an alley and then try and dispose of your body. At best, they might throw you in a dumpster. Well, once again, the police looked in the dumpsters, and not only that, but they went to the landfill. So the chances that he ended up in one of those dumpsters, very slim. And it wasn't just the alley dumpsters they looked at. They actually looked at most of the dumpsters around this area. One of the things about this case that just it conflicts with something I said in our very first episode. In our very first episode, I said the through line in a lot of these cases is bad police work. That didn't happen here. By all accounts, the police scoured this city looking for Brian. They looked everywhere. So that leads some people to think, well, if he fell in the river, or if he was put in the river, his body could have been carried downstream and, disappeared somewhere and he's never found. This leads us to the precipice of a very deep rabbit hole. The smiley face killers. There are people who speculate that Brian is a victim of the smiley face killer who, if he or she or they exist, may be the most prolific serial killers of all time. Over the last 2 decades, young college-age men, just like Brian, have disappeared only to have their bodies found in water near a smiley face graffiti tag. There are a number of homicide detectives from New York who have developed this theory and have accumulated a large number of potential victims. And I will say this. There's some weird cases that they've pointed to. And you can spend a lot of time on the smiley face killer theory. I do not personally believe in it, for what that's worth. We may spend a whole episode on it at some point, but there are people who think Brian was a victim of this. Now, here's the problem. So let's imagine that Brian, he somehow got out of the bar without the cameras catching him. There are, like I said, there are conflicting reports about whether or not there are cameras on every one of these exits. There was a freight elevator in the back that some people say was not covered by cameras that he could have taken. The memory on one of the cameras was apparently overwritten fairly frequently. There's disputes about whether or not the police got to that camera before the memory was overwritten. And then there's just sort of the ordinary things don't always work the way they're supposed to, and that maybe not all these cameras are functioning. So the idea that there was 100% coverage on every exit, it's possible that that's just not true. However, even if that were the case, Brian would then have had to go 1.6 miles to the nearest body of water, the Olentangy River, which runs through Columbus. Now, it is true that both Ohio State University and the Ohio State Medical Center are in that direction, so you can sort of imagine Brian, for some reason, deciding he needs to go back to one of those. I don't know if he had spent any time in the medical center, but given that he is a doctor or was going to be a doctor, was in training to be a doctor, it's possible that he had spent some time there. Maybe he needed a book or something from the university. Maybe he realized, like, hey, I'm right here. I can stop by, grab what I need, and then I won't have to come back before I leave for Miami. That's conceivable. There's no evidence of it, but it's conceivable. But he would have had to have walked 1.6 miles and managed to avoid all of those other cameras that would have caught him. And how could he do that? And then, what? He just walks up to the Olentangy and falls in. I mean, I guess it's possible somebody mugs him there and throws him in there. But once again, there's no reason to actually think he was anywhere near that river, and there's no evidence of it. And the fact that nothing catches him nothing ever even catches him leaving the bar, but nothing catches him even heading in the direction of the river, much less being anywhere near it. It's an attractive theory just because it gets rid of the body. And one thing I've noticed about missing persons cases is they always come back to water at some point. Yeah, people always speculate that they ended up in water because it's just a good way to get rid of a body. But I just don't think it's possible that it happened here.
Yeah, I think people like to stick to bodies of water theories because water can wash away a lot of things, and you bring in the elements of the force of nature, which I think it kind of borders on the paranormal. It's not quite the same, but when you think about how powerful nature is, storms, water, bodies of water, there's an element of saying we don't know anything else.
And there's something psychological about water too. I always get really nervous walking over a bridge because I'm always afraid I'm going to drop something, in the water. And if you drop it in the water, it's gone, right? Like there's just this sense that water, like you said, it washes away all sins. It takes away everything. If something goes in it, it never comes out. Now, one of the problems is that's not actually true. The Olentangy, at this point, it gets down as low as 2 to 3 feet in places. Now it's deeper in other parts, but the notion that Brian's body could have washed down that river, out to the sea, I guess, without anyone finding him given that the police scoured this river and searched the riverbanks, I don't see how it could happen. I don't see how they would miss it.
Seems unlikely. And I want to say something about the smiley face killer. Now, this is unsolved. We don't know if it's one killer or multiple killers. If it's over decades, I tend to think there are probably some copycats in there, even if it is one person, primarily. The issue with someone who tags all their victims like this is typically they have a big ego about what they do. And if Brian is in fact the victim of a serial killer who enjoys tagging their victims, and Brian's never found and attributed to this serial killer, the serial killer probably wants one of the most famous disappearances to be linked to him or her. And so, we've seen this before where people try to lead police to the victim so that there can be more development in the case, because they don't actually want to live in mystery. They want some sort of infamy from being associated with the victim, even if it means they don't want to be caught. And so if in fact Brian is part of this group of victims of the smiley face killer, he's never found with a tag, so he's not actually attributed to the killer. And I know I'm going down a rabbit hole of what the killer may or may not think, but we often find that serial killers do want people to know about their victims.
And just to support that, the theory is actually that the victims are dumped in a particular place where the body will be found and where that tag will be seen. So you're absolutely right. If the smiley face killers did this, they would have wanted everyone to know that Brian was the victim. And that's assuming they even exist. But no, I think you're 100% right.
So now, this leads us to the last theory we're going to discuss before we talk about what we think happened to Brian. Brian never left the bar. So is it possible that Brian is actually still there somewhere in the bar? I know this sounds crazy. I don't mean that Brian's just sitting in some back room, not in the paranormal sense, but like a literal back room just drinking his troubles away. No. There have been other cases like this, and I have a case that I actually know about that I'll get to. But there's the case of Eduardo Sanchez. He was a disc jockey, and he went missing, but about more than a year after he went missing, his body was actually found between two walls in the basement of a nightclub. In 2015, Mary Cerruti disappeared in Houston, Texas, and they couldn't find her for years. But about 2 years later, her skeletal remains were found in the walls of her house. In 2009, Larry Eli Murillo Moncada also disappeared. And a decade later, his remains were found behind a cooler in the supermarket where he worked. And in that particular case, it's actually thought that he had fallen into the 18-inch gap between the back of the cooler and the wall where he was trapped, and the noise of the cooler compressors may have concealed his attempts to call for help. So in that last case, it seems it may have been by accident rather than someone putting him there. At first glance, this may seem like a crazy theory, but my first year at Yale, there actually was a very similar case. A medical student, a young Asian woman, went missing. It was the first month of school, it may even have been the first week of school. And of course, New Haven is not a very large town. It spread across campus in the town like fire. The news did. No one could find her. It was a very interesting case. Everyone thought maybe she ran away because she disappeared just the week of her before her wedding, and beginning of the school year. People speculated that she was trying to run away from the marriage as opposed to just breaking it off. And they scoured campus. They couldn't find her. And then it was within the semester, I can't remember how long, but she was missing for quite some time. I want to say about a month. The police actually found her stuffed into the walls of the medical building where she had been doing tests on lab rats. And I mean, we were all living it in real time. I think every girl on campus, every woman on campus was terrified that we would somehow be stuffed into the walls of Yale. And so this theory hits me particularly hard because I remember living through the fear of the girl stuffed into the medical school walls when I was at Yale.
And what ended up happening with that?
Oh, so I believe there's been a conviction in the case, but they were able to track her um, ID card. You had to badge in and out of buildings, and specifically into this research lab. I think it was in the basement, and they were able to track who followed her in. And the last person to go in was a guy who cleaned the rat cages. And he is the one they arrested for it. I believe he either pled or went to trial, but I believe he's been convicted of the murder.
Wow.
And yeah, it's really sad because we've talked about how these are real people behind these crimes, and for a long time before they could find her, all the attention was on her fiance. They thought he did it. First, they thought she ran away, but then they thought that maybe he had killed her, and it really did not bear out to be the case. And here he is, not only having lost the love of his life days before their wedding, but being accused of murdering her. I can't even imagine, the grief and suffering he had to be pulled through. Oh, here's actually a crazy story. A year later, I had like a mentee at the law school, and I was talking to her. I said, how is law school going? And she said, things are going pretty well, except, my living situation has been really stressful. So at that time, Yale did not have dorms for the law students. They now have some dorms, but at the time, everyone lived off campus. And she goes, well, I moved in and to my apartment, and about a month later, the FBI came by and said that I couldn't come into my apartment. And I was like, whoa, what happened? Why? And she said, apparently the girl who was murdered and stuffed into the medical school walls, this was her apartment. And my landlady never told me that this was still a scene of the crime and it was still under investigation, and she didn't have a right to rent it out. And so my mentee was like completely displaced in the first month of school because she had accidentally rented a crime scene.
Wow. That seems like a lawsuit.
No kidding. We were like, landlord tenant clinic, maybe we can help you. But
right. And there you go. I mean, these things happen. You may think that's a crazy theory that he's still there somewhere in the walls, but that's 4 stories right there. I mean, look, if you want to go back to the Clint theory and that Clint killed him really fast, maybe Clint killed him really fast and stuffed him into a wall. I guess that's a possibility.
In 5 minutes.
In 5 minutes. Yeah, somehow he did that in 5 minutes. I mean, I think a more likely, if you want to sort of walk through how this would happen, is he does go, maybe he goes to the bathroom, and I've been in this situation. I can imagine this. And I do weird things like, I was at a bar once that it was in a morgue. The bar was of an old hospital. So basically there was this old hospital building and they were renovating it, but they hadn't done anything with the hospital itself, but they had turned the morgue into a bar. So you could go to this bar. And I was like, I got to do that. Right. That sounds awesome. So I went to this morgue bar, and then at some point I was there with my friend. And then at some point I was like, I'm going to the bathroom, and I went to the bathroom, and I realized when I was back there that the door that connected the morgue to the old hospital was partially open. So I was like, well, I'm going to check out the hospital. So I went from the bathroom into the hospital and ended up just wandering around this old deserted hospital by myself for 30 minutes. When I came back, my friend was super mad because he had no idea where I was or what had happened to me. But, who knows that if there was something could have happened there, right? Where I ended up falling into a hole or whatnot. So you could sort of imagine that Brian goes to the bathroom. And I just feel like he went to the bathroom because that's what you do before you leave the bar. He goes to the bathroom and he decides, I don't really want to say bye to Clint and Meredith. I don't really want to get back into all that mess. I'm just going to go out, through the freight elevator or down the fire escape or whatever. And something happens where he stumbles into something that a place he shouldn't be, and ends up there and nobody's found him. And if you want to connect us to connect this to the construction site, I guess you could say, going back to this whole in the walls thing, that maybe he fell into a constructed wall. I mean, partially constructed wall. It would have to be somewhere, like we said, where they wouldn't see you, they wouldn't find you. But you could imagine something like that.
To that point, I have to say, bodies even in walls rot. And one thing about the girl at Yale was the reason they couldn't find her for so long, even though they had dogs searching, is that I believe the person who ended up killing her, he worked in this lab, and I think he had actually soaked her body in some other formaldehyde to mask the smell of a rotting body. And so that was part of the reason it took so long to find her. But again, she was found, within the semester.
Well, the Eduardo Sanchez case that you mentioned, it's actually interesting and sort of similar to what might have happened here. There's no foul play suspected in that. No one knows how he ended up in that wall, but they think he did it himself accidentally. There was some smell, but it's a bar. And this is kind of disgusting, I guess, but everybody just assumed that's like, stale beer and whatever, like rotten beer nuts or whatever. So even though he had disappeared and his body was there, nobody connected that one thing to the other. I mean, you're right. It is hard to believe that you could have people in a building where someone is known to disappear, where the police are doing everything they're doing and they're bringing in the dogs and everything else, and you just don't find Brian. But, the problem is, you go back to that, I keep going back to this, the whole, if you eliminate the impossible, whatever's left type thing. And I sort of feel like Brian decided to do something that would make his life just a little bit easier so he wouldn't have to go back into the public area, and that led him to take some other exit. And now the problem is, we're getting the theories.
Well, no, yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't know what happened after that.
Right. Well, I was going to say on that theory, I could imagine, I've been thinking a lot about this. What could he have done? I could imagine that it's closing time. There's probably a rush for the bathroom, or they're cleaning out the bathrooms, and maybe he had to go to the bathroom, and instead of fighting his way back to the stall, that's already either closed or a long line, he maybe tried to go somewhere to go to the bathroom, and that's when something happened, like the accident, like you were talking about the chain link fence.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Maybe he thought there has to be an employee bathroom around here somewhere. There has to be another one, and goes looking for it. That's absolutely could have happened.
Or just trying to find somewhere private to go to the bathroom.
People, I go back to like people's assumption of rule following. People will always say, well, there's no way he could have gotten out because all the other exits are only for the employees, It's like, no, he could have just decided to do this thing he wasn't supposed to do. So he could have gone to a part of the building that wasn't normally used, or that was only for employees, or whatever, like you said, for whatever reason, whether he's looking for the bathroom or he just knows, he's been to this bar a bunch of times. He may know there's another exit. He may have used that exit before. We just don't know. Now, I got to think, whatever happened, and I think going back to why the construction theory is so popular, whatever happened to him, whether he's still in that bar or not, he didn't get far. If he'd gotten far, someone would have seen him, or the cameras would have picked him up. This notion that he could just vanish into thin air or avoid being caught on any of these cameras in Columbus, I just don't think it's possible. So they've done a lot of renovation at the Ugly Tuna, and I know a lot of people were sort of like on pins and needles when they were doing that about whether or not you're going to see a story, mummified remains found in the Ugly Tuna Saloon. They didn't find that. So maybe that debunks this theory. I don't know. But I mean, look, we can talk about our theories if you want to. Man, this is a throw your hands up in the air. I have basically no idea what happened.
I have no idea.
The longer I think about it, the less I know, It's just
Right. No, same here. Yesterday, when we were doing the first part of the podcast, I thought I had an idea, but as we go through these theories, I think, no, I don't think that can be the theory
Yeah, I
anymore.
mean, it seems like so many of the theories are just impossible. They're just not actually even possible that they happened.
I think there's, you know, stranger things have happened, but I think this was probably a series of impossible accidents all in a row. Like he somehow slipped out undetected in the one spot that's not covered by camera coverage. And then he slips and falls somewhere that no one expects, or he somehow finds himself in a place that no one would think to look. I I don't think this was some sort of I don't think he was murdered.
I think if he was murdered, they would have found him by now.
Yeah, I agree with that. It just seems like a chain of very improbable events that led to this happening.
It's kind of like an unreliable narrator in a book. I mean, there's part of me that thinks we are being misled about something. And I've tried to track this down and just haven't been able to, that there really weren't that many cameras on the other exits, or there was a path you could take that didn't have much surveillance. It was the one part of Columbus that really didn't have many cameras, and it's conceivable that he went that way. I would think that given the attention this case has had and the number of people who've looked at it, that if that were true, we would know it by now. You hear some people talk about that maybe the cameras on the employee exits weren't that good, and that's how he got out. But the next step, you never see the whole, well, how do you get past the rest of the cameras,
Now, what I do think may have happened, I think what may have happened is I don't think he's alive anymore. I don't think someone killed him. And I don't think the reason I don't think he's alive is I don't think anything in his life points to him wanting to run away and disappear and start a new life. Um, I think it's a coincidence that he was going through a lot of grief for the recent passing of his mother, but I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with his disappearance here.
Well, he's so different from Maura Murray, and I don't know if that's just because we don't know as much about him, but when you looked at the Maura Murray case, there were so many little things that had happened in her life coming up to when she disappeared that you could tie a thread through them and say, this is what would have put her in that place. Here, all we have is that his mom died. That's it. And just think about what he would be putting his father and brother through, and then his poor brother who loses his father 2 years later. I mean, he lost his mom, his brother, and his father in the space of 2.5 years. And we'd have no reason to think Brian would do that. I mean, he wants to be in a band and hang out on the beach, and that makes you think he would do this to his family? That's crazy. I don't see that at all.
And again, unlike in Maura Murray, where there was some indication that things were not great with her boyfriend, there's no indication of that here with Alexis. He was planning on going on a trip with her. The things she remembers him saying to her have nothing to do with problem in their relationship. They have to do with his grief. And so it doesn't seem like there's any problem with their relationship, and she's not around when this happens.
Right. Yeah. When we started researching this case, I thought maybe she did it and she's lying about the whole thing, but then I found out she was in Toledo. So yeah, look, this is probably the most unsatisfying podcast episode you're ever going to listen to, because I feel like in most of our cases, we're going to come to some conclusion. We're going to have some theory that we think is at least probable. In this one, I am not kidding when I say that aliens and the paranormal are probably middle of the pack of the theories in probability, and the ones that I find more probable than that, I don't even find that probable. Like I said, I feel like there is just a piece of information we don't have.
Based on our experience of investigating cases, This is very rare where you do this much research and have this much, you pour this many resources into it and you come up with nothing. So while this is dissatisfying, this is not the typical case at all. We may decline to prosecute a case because we don't think the evidence is strong enough, but rarely do I have a case where I have no idea what happened whatsoever.
Yeah. And I think, the police and the police officer who has handled this case has been pretty open with the public. And, this case haunts him. He talks about how one time he was working an Ohio State game and he saw somebody that he thought looked like Brian across the crowd. And he chases this poor guy down to try and find out whether it's him. And I will tell you that a lot of the cases we're going to talk about, the police know who did it. They have a very strong feeling, and they just can't prove it. That is not the case here. As like Alice said, as much effort and energy and resources as they've poured into this, they have no idea. And that's why this case is just insane. Like I said, though, it's possible we've missed something. This is one where, if you're from Ohio, people in Ohio know this case. This is a super famous case for those folks. I know, like I said, this got True Crime Garage started. I know James Renner's looked into this. Their podcast really kind of dedicated to just this. There's one you guys should check out if you're interested in this called the Comeback Podcast, which is just about this case. It's very much an investigation, so prepare yourself for some rough audio in it. But it's a case or a podcast where they have talked to the police who were involved. They've talked to the private investigators. They've talked to the family. So you really do get about as much information as you possibly could from that podcast. It's only 5 episodes long, so it won't even take you that long to listen to. And that should give you an idea, right? Maura Murray's up to 120 or whatever, and the Brian Shaffer podcast ends after 5 episodes because there's just nothing.
There's nothing to go on.
So, I don't know, Alice. I feel like we failed on this one.
I don't think we failed, Brett. We tried. We tried our best.
We did. We gave it our all. And that's all you can do. Well, I don't know, Alice. Do you have any other thoughts?
I think that's it on this gun. But if you have a thought, not you, but the listeners, if you guys have a thought, let us know. We would always love to hear from you, especially on a case such as this where your guess is as good as mine.
Yeah, absolutely. prosecutorspod@gmail.com, @prosecutorspod on Twitter and Instagram. Our website is prosecutorspodcast.com. We'd love to hear what you think about this case. If we hear, any good theories or any updates or any holes in the analysis that we conducted, we will certainly let you guys know, because this one's a weird one. Next week, we're going to be back with a new case. Hopefully, we can provide some better answers to the questions in that case. But until that time, I'm Brett.
And I'm Alice.
And we are the Prosecutors.
Like a work.
No, not a working morgue. That would be doubly weird. But it was in a morgue